But with this, we can take a hot particle and say, all right, the person in this household, if that person had inhaled this particular particle, their odds would be 7% or 70% of contracting a lung cancer, or an epithelial tissue cancer, or a nasopharyngeal cancer. You can actually see which one of these is more likely once you have the photograph of the particle. So it's a time-consuming analysis, but it tells us a lot about what the potential hazards are. And it's a good way to diagnose which areas are going to have which types of potential health damages. The sample that we got came from Nagoya in Japan. It's 460 kilometers from the accident site. That's about 300 miles away. The hot particle was 10 microns across. That means it is 10 1/millionths of a meter across. Obviously something you're only going to see with a powerful microscope. The particle was actually in the size range of dusts that can be inhaled and then retained in the lungs. And this is important because if you're a health physicist and you're calculating the dose that you would get from this particle, you'd have to consider that this particle might actually be trapped and result in a lifetime exposure. Think of asbestos workers who inhale an asbestos particle, and when they eventually die, for whatever reason, that asbestos particle is still in their lungs. Well, this kind of hot particle would probably do something very, very similar. The particle that we examined was a mixture of fission products from a nuclear reactor and nuclear fuels. We looked at materials like tellurium, radium-226, we saw cesium-134 and 137, cobalt-60, and a whole zoo of isotopes that probably you'll never hear about on CNN, but you'd have to be a physicist to understand. Let's put it this way, 80% by weight of this particle was made up of pure reactor core materials. So that tells me that something that came directly from the accident, directly from the core, could escape containment and travel a very, very significant distance. So it's a long distance to travel, and what happens is the particle is so very small that it will essentially travel with whatever gas it's entrained in. The winds will blow it long distances. What's going to happen is the further you get away from the reactor, the less likely you are to find a hot particle of this magnitude. But of course, we've looked at so many samples from Japan. This just happens to be the longest distance and the hottest particle that we found. I have to put some numbers on it. In Japan, we measure radiation in becquerels. A becquerel is obviously named after someone. It's named after Henri Becquerel. And a becquerel means 1 radioactive disintegration per second. Now in Japan, if your food has more than 100 becquerels in a kilogram, about 45 becquerels in a pound, then it's not considered safe to eat. The number is a bit higher in the United States, but if we use 100 becquerels per kilogram as a guide, it's something too radioactive to eat, this material was in the petabecquerel per kilogram range. Now, you probably don't hear that prefix very often. The number we're looking at is 4, followed by 19 zeros. That many becquerels per kilogram. That's a very, very high number. And essentially, that's the kind of number you get when you look at core material. It is a tiny particle. In fact, the total number of becquerels from the particle was only about 310 becquerels for the particle. And so when we got our vacuum cleaner bag, the entire vacuum cleaner bag clicked away in our counter at 310 becquerels, which is a little higher than average for our Fukushima prefecture vacuum cleaner bags. So we didn't think too much of it. Although everything is done in a glove box or in a hood, when we separated the sample in half, this is the first step in identifying if a hot particle was present. When we separated the sample in half and analyzed half the sample, you'd expect to get 155 becquerels, right? Half of 310. In fact, compared to background, we got none. So we thought, all right, we'll measure the other half. And the other half, none. That's the way to go. If we take the entire sample and put it in, we're back to 310 becquerels. It's a bit of a mystery. Until we realized that at the very center of the two samples, the razor knife that we'd used to collect this, had actually hit the hot particle and it stuck to the razor. And so we were able to put the razor into the microscope and carefully collect that hot particle and see just how much that was clicking away with the radiation detectors. So it was, we short-circuited the process a little bit, but that's exactly the method that you would use to try and find a hot particle. You just keep dividing your sample until you can find the part of it that has that high radiation emitter. If you look at the black dust, and we've received samples of that from Nami and Iitate and a couple of other communities in northern Japan, this is very similar to the black sand that people see. The black sand, and this particle too, it's an aggregate, it's a mixture. If you think of a hunk of concrete, it's actually a mix of sand and cement and small stones. That's what it looks like under the microscope. So essentially what we're talking about is a worst case for black sand. That's what this hot particle is. So this material was vaporized during the accident. It condenses into these small particles, and then they aggregate, they congeal, they collect, and they make particles big enough to be detected. They fly around in the winds, and sooner or later they hit something and they stick to it. You know, in the case of Nagoya, the sample blew in with the outside air and appears to have just lodged somewhere into a carpet or floor material, something in the house that had been vacuum cleaned, then collected in the vacuum cleaner bag. The good news is repeated sampling at the same location, getting additional material from there, we've never found another particle like that. So it's not like there's anything about this particular house or that there is, according to our data, more than one of these particles in the home. Doesn't appear that there is. But it does tell me that it's worth looking at for a particular area. What's the probability of there being a hot particle present? Because it has such a big impact on people's exposure and potential health damages. So far, for our Japanese samples from Fukushima Prefecture and from Tokyo, about 25% of those samples contain at least a few measurable hot particles. Only one that was this hot, and this was the worst case. It doesn't represent any kind of average, but it does tell you what's possible. The bottom line is, now that I've had time to digest the entire set of samples and put the number of hot particles per sample in perspective, take this data and put it before a peer review panel at Worcester Polytechnic Institute and prepare all this data for publication, it's good to see that it's going to be possible to find a real exposure number where we can take the average exposures that we're used to dealing with and also add in a probability for being exposed to a hot particle so that we can find out what the true level of potential health damage is from an accident of this magnitude.